Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. All right, so today is special. I have someone who I couldn't get in person, but was able to record some audio. So the majority of today's podcast and episode lesson that we'll be studying on Genesis 21 is going to come from my good friend Isaac Soriano, who is assistant pastoring right now, and he's been taking biblical studies. He's been a good friend that I've Bible studied with for years. And so since we are just entering the story of Abraham's son Isaac, I thought there was no one better to bring on the show than him. So I'm going to, majority of the time, let him speak, and I'll play his audio, and I'm going to interject just a few times with some extra input. So without further ado, here's my friend Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Isaac Soriano. I am here, thankful to be on this podcast talking about the Bible. What better place to start for somebody named Isaac than Genesis chapter 21? It is one of my favorite topics to talk about because Isaac is my favorite patriarch. I might be a little biased, but I like his story from the beginning to the end. There's so much in here. It's so deep.
Yeah.
I love talking about him. A lot of fun facts come up, a lot of cool things. He is different from all the other patriarchs with a lot of different things happen. A lot of similar things happen too.
Mm-hmm.
He's often a patriarch that doesn't get talked about. Abraham is talked about a lot, and so is Jacob. But Isaac seems to be left out.
Yeah, as we go through the stories of Isaac, you'll see just how much shorter it is than the others.
So today we're going to start talking about Isaac and his beginnings. He's been alluded to in the past. Everything has been foreshadowed here, but in Genesis chapter 21, where we're going to start off, it is where things really start happening here. Genesis chapter 21, so I'll be reading today from the English Standard Version, but you can follow along with me in any of the versions you have. We're going to talk about Genesis chapter 21. It starts off with Isaac. It seems like it goes away from talking about Isaac for a little bit, and then it comes right back to talking all about Abraham, his family, and then we'll see how it ties into chapter 22. So let's begin with verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah, and he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. So just right off the bat, the Lord, starting off with God, he is talking to Sarah, and the Lord did what he had promised. So we already have here talking about God. He's talking to Sarah. Sarah, of course, did not believe him, and now he did what he has promised. So we know that God is a God of promises, and we'll see that throughout chapter 21. But he is also a God that keeps his promises. And verse 1 right off the bat shows us that whatever he says, he's going to keep. And that is a promise you can count on. You can take that to the bank any day. Whatever God says goes. So he said to Sarah what he was going to do to conceive a child. She didn't believe him, of course, but here he is. And what God has promised, he has delivered on here in just the first verse.
Yeah, I actually wanted to expand on that right away. So there's a few really special things. One is that, as you were mentioning, God keeps his promises, and that's important for a few reasons. First off, God, everything about him is about faith, and God is a God of faithfulness. So he's trustworthy, and he expects us to trust him. And so that was actually one of the main characteristics Abraham was actually praised for earlier on, was his faith. And it's one of the key characteristics that is mentioned all through the Bible. And Abraham is actually praised even in the New Testament in other books for his faith. And God is the one who is truly keeping the faith at the core of things, because also covenant, like we've talked about, God's partnership with Abraham. He made a promise to Abraham that he was going to give him descendants. And he technically already gave him Ishmael, but I think it was clear that it was supposed to come through his wife. And they're beyond the point of having children, 100 years old, having kids. His wife was 90, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's almost completely absurd. But that is the crazy part of it. But we'll talk about this in a minute. But God's faithfulness and him keeping his covenant and his promises with the partnership he made with Abraham are the big standouts.
Now, verse 2, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son at his old age, at the time which God had spoken to him. So, verse 2, you see that Sarah conceived and bore to Abraham. So, it seems a little quick, but as we know, it was 9 months for Isaac to be, to be born. But at Abraham's old age, it doesn't talk about Sarah's old age here, but it says on Abraham's old age, which is an interesting thing to talk about here. That we're talking about Abraham, we're talking about him being old, but still being able to conceive a child with Sarah at the time which God had spoken to him. So basically, here he's saying, God said, this is the time that's going to happen. And in verse 2, we see it happened exactly the way God had said, the way God had spoken, the way Abraham heard it. That's how it happened. Even though it was impossible.
Yeah, I want to reiterate and bring everyone's attention back to remembering chapter 18, because not only had God more than once told Abraham he was going to have a kid, but he specifically was telling him in chapter 18 through himself and the two angels, the three men who visited him, if you remember, right before Sodom, before that incident in chapter 18. It's kind of funny. In verse 10, it says, one of them said, I'll surely return to you when the season comes around next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, not too far from him. Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in years. Sarah had long passed menopause. That means it's literally impossible, or almost completely impossible, for her to have kids. Because it says that, it literally means that she did not have any of the necessary factors anymore to be able to even have kids at all. And look at what's happening. Literally, one of these three men was prophesying. They were telling her in advance, which is what prophecy is, one part of it. There's so much more to prophecy, like we talked about, or have started hinting at, is he tells her that she's going to have a kid by this time next year. And It's pretty crazy because here she is in her old age having a kid, and it is a year past, just like Isaac had said, just like God and these two angels, and one of them had told Sarah that she's going to have a kid, and it seems like God. So God is coming back and visiting and bringing them a child a year later, just like he promised. And we've already talked about that links in with his covenant, and that he's also trustworthy, even though no one could have ever guessed or predicted or planned something of this sort. But here she was. And the funny part is, it says in verse 12 of chapter 18, so Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, after I'm worn out, will I have pleasure, especially when my husband is old too? Look at that word that appears at the beginning. So Sarah laughed to herself. Does that word ring a bell? Well, here we go. Isaac, his story of being Isaac, or essentially his name laughter, literally was being created as a story even before he was born. God said something to Abraham and Sarah. Sarah's laughing even before she gets pregnant. And here they are a year later with a baby, and now it's like a laughter of dumbfoundedness and joy because of her getting to have the pleasure of having a child.
So verse 3, Abraham calls the name of his son, whom was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Now we all know Isaac means laughter, and that's going to be important coming up here soon. But so God had already said that you're going to name him Laughter, named him Isaac, and here it is happening right in front of their eyes. Isaac is born. This right here, verse 3, we often just skip through it, but it is the culmination of what God has said. He has been promised, you're going to have a child. His name is going to be Isaac. Here it is. In verse 3, Sarah bore him. His name was Isaac. So he had just been born. And then verse 4, Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, and as God commanded him to do so. So he was born 8 days later, he got circumcised. That must have hurt. That was the crying baby. But God had commanded him to do so, and when God makes a command, you do it. And this was something, of course, to set him apart from everybody else. And it's something that we see again, and we'll see later on the importance of all of this. That's just important to know. So he was born. 8 days later, he was circumcised, and so set apart there. Now, so he was promised, he was set apart. Now, when Abraham was 100 years old, and Isaac had just been born, right now, as far as we know, he's 8 days old, just got circumcised. His story is just beginning, and Abraham's already 100. That's a big difference there.
So, 2 notes on that. We also remember back in chapter 17, in verse 17 itself, it actually talks about Abraham while he was making the covenant with God, and God's giving him all of these promises. And Abraham asks, can I have a son born to me at 100 years old? And can Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? So he's 100 when he has the kid. That's what it says there. So obviously this is happening all within the year span or right around that time. And I think that's pretty insane and crazy. And another thing that I want to bring up right before we cycle around back to Isaac and then back to the text, is the fact that Sarah is not only still able to have kids at this time because God's allowing her, but the fact that she, in between that time, it has the story of Abraham and Sarah in the land of the Philistines, the land of Gerar with King Abimelech, and he almost takes Abraham's wife. You know, I mentioned it in that podcast, but what if he would have actually taken her? What if God wouldn't have intervened? It didn't seem like Abraham was going to get his wife back. Was he going to give up that promise if it wasn't for God stepping in and being faithful and keeping that covenant? God made a promise to him he's going to have a kid, and that's why I think God went to the measures that he did. Abraham could have lost that when he was in the land, and we'll find out in the end of this chapter that he's still hanging around in those lands, and we'll talk more about that. But like I was and have been saying, it's so important to connect and remember all of these stories together. So I not only want us to break down just the text, but also link the stories and to remember all these things as a bigger picture. Like, this isn't just, a few sentences here and there scattered about Abraham does this, Abraham does that. It's all one big story of his life, and one major theme of his life is the covenant he made with God, and we can see it carried out here. And part of that covenant, again, was the circumcision at 8, which I know Isaac just mentioned. And that is to set himself apart, and part of the agreement, and to show to God that he's serious about their relationship and his covenant with him. And we'll see that, like Isaac mentioned, the 8-day-old circumcision actually appears again in Scripture, and we see it even in the New Testament, where Jesus at 8 days old is actually circumcised, and he's brought in for a blessing. And he's actually blessed by 2 prophets, one prophet and one prophetess. And so it's a pretty cool moment. And so this is a moment, of course, of pain for the baby, but the babies don't remember it, thankfully. It causes them the pain in the moment, but he's receiving a blessing, if anything, a blessing with God for life. And he has now the sign that he's set apart to God. So Isaac's going to keep reading here.
And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. So Sarah here is saying, God has made laughter for me. So physically creating laughter. So laughter is a physical form, which is Isaac. And God had made Isaac for her. So it's almost a gift for her, which is interesting because God made her laugh before while she was doubting. She was not sure about all this. But now God had made her laughter physical into her child, Isaac. And anyone who hears will laugh over me. So basically saying, anybody who hears this will also laugh with me. So it's not a laughter anymore it's not a laughter of unbelief anymore. It's a laughter of amazement, astonishment. We see here what God has done is unheard of and amazing, that you will see, you would awe about it. And Sarah recognizes this and is basically saying, okay, before I doubted. Now I have seen the incredible things that God has done for me. And anybody else who sees this, they will also laugh, in this case, be astonished by what has happened. Verse 7, she's like, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son at his old age. Again, at his old age. And it says, who would have thought this? She's saying again, she's amazed at what just happened. Who would have thought this was possible? But here it is in the flesh. And the child grew and weaned and was weaned. So again, he grew up. So we have Isaac being born, Isaac circumcised, now he's grown up, he's been weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on that day. Isaac was weaned. So a big step, a big stepping stone here. Abraham recognizes this. He is growing up. He's being weaned off the milk. He doesn't need this anymore. He's becoming older. And now he's saying, here, we're going to throw a feast. We're going to celebrate. Isaac is getting bigger. He's stronger. He's surviving being a baby. Because not all babies did survive when they were young, and even up to this stage here. So,
Yeah, I actually wanted to bring in a little bit of research for a minute. So I learned exactly what was being said, that unfortunately, if you think about it, back in those times, for a baby to survive past their babyhood was actually quite an important feat, because many times it is easy, especially, them living out in the wilderness, sometimes a lack of resources, trying to keep their baby alive in the conditions that they had, with the lack of medical and advances to intervene for sicknesses or anything that could go wrong in a baby's adolescence as they're beginning to go from being a baby to transitioning into a toddler around 2 to 3 years old. It says in that 8th verse that he actually had grown to the point where he was weaned. And again, that's the 2 to 3 year range as I was looking up. And it's such a big accomplishment back in that time that, as it actually says, and we're going to read about in a minute, that there was a feast thrown. So basically, this is like a milestone celebration and party that they would have back in the cultures of that time. And similar to a milestone birthday, it was a big accomplishment, and we will see more as we keep reading. But I wanted to mention how this is a pretty big thing that happened, because not only could Isaac have been born, but especially with him being born to a 90-year-old mother, there could have been complications off the charts. But yet here he is, moving on to his toddler adolescence phase. And he's made it past the hard part now of being a baby. And now they're celebrating because he has a hopeful future.
this is amazing. And Abraham recognizes this. So we see Isaac just growing, different stages in life. And now we're in this feast where, verse 9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had bore to Abraham, laughing. So there again, at the end, you see the word laughing. So Sarah saw the other son of Hagar. She obviously doesn't like it. Now that Isaac is there, that is the the legitimate son of Abraham. So now you have this other boy, older boy, who's there. He's laughing. The Bible doesn't say what or who he's laughing at. Maybe he's just laughing, having fun. Maybe he's laughing at Isaac because he's a baby. Maybe he's older now, but he's still very young. Might be doing something fun or silly, or maybe he's just mocking Isaac. The Bible is unclear, but this laughing part is very important. And some scholars have said that it was a mocking laugh because of what happened next. In verse 10, she says to Abraham, "Cast out your slave woman and with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Basically saying, clearly, this son of yours, and the son of hers, actually, he calls him son, the slave woman, her son. If we look at verse 10, and then Sarah says the son of the slave woman. So not calling him by his name, and not even saying that it is the son of Abraham. This way, Abraham is another way of Sarah saying, this is not your real son. Isaac is your real son. God has promised him that this is your real son. Now, it's interesting. Before Isaac was born, it seemed like Sarah was more okay with this because it was Sarah's idea initially for her slave woman to have a son, Hagar to have a son. But now that Isaac's born and that he's growing up, she's not okay with it anymore. And she says that, he has to go because he's going to grow up, he's going to cause problems. And of course, we know from history that, having two sons, both fighting over an inheritance is not good.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe she had a good thought in her head or idea, but from what we can see, she also felt threatened by this boy and his mother. And the thing is, Abraham didn't like it. Verse 11, the things were very displeasing to Abraham on the account of his son, because it was his son. And verse 11 says it was his son, and we know it was his son, but Sarah says, he said it was the son of the slave. Here in verse 11, it's like Abraham says, "Oh, it's my son." And he's not happy with any of this. He's very displeased, very upset about this. And rightfully so. It's understandable. It's understandable that you'd be upset with this when you have to banish your own son. And of course, he probably didn't want to do it.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in and actually go back to chapter 17 again, because you see that he was concerned when God was promising him a son. He actually brought up, well, like, hey, what about my son Ishmael? Why won't he work? Isn't he good enough? Like, why can't you just make the promise come through him? Like, it would work maybe better that way. I already got him. And, what am I going to do? Like, what kind of blessing am I going to pass on to him? Like, you already gave me this gift. And so he was already battling this moment that's come now. Even before Isaac was born, he dreaded that this kind of day might actually come. And we'll see what God does next. But as we keep reading, we'll see how God is fair and accommodating, even though it doesn't seem that way at first.
But God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased, so don't be upset because of the boy and because of the slave woman. So don't be upset because of the child and because of his mother. Whatever Sarah says to you to do as she tells you." Wouldn't most wives love it for God himself to say that to their husband? Whatever she says to do, do it. Because then it continues, "For through Isaac shall your offspring be named." And basically, God is saying, it's okay. Don't worry. Do not be upset. Do what Sarah has said. Now, it's interesting because this is God is saying not only do what she has said, but it's before, this is not what God was thinking before, because Sarah came and said, have children with my slave. And we all know that God did not say for Abraham to do that. And now it's causing this problem. So Sarah had a terrible idea before, and Abraham was not supposed to listen to her. And now verse 12, God's saying, okay, you do have to listen to her. So it seems a little harsh right now, verse 12. But God has a plan, and he says that this is what you need to do. And this is the reason, the reason why is not fully explained here. But it also talks about Isaac again. Through Isaac shall your offspring be. So it's talking about Isaac is your son. This is where your offspring will come. This is where your children, the nation that I promised you, will be through, not through the son of Hagar. So don't worry about it. I know. And Abraham is always trusting God through all of this. He didn't trust God before with Isaac, so now he's trusting God here with Hagar and her son. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring.
Mm-hmm.
Now, verse 13, God is stating here, I will make a nation out of the son of the slave woman also. So he's making another promise. And as we saw in verse 1, if God makes a promise, he's going to keep it. So he's saying, this is what's going to happen. And why is he going to do this? Because he is Abraham's offspring also. So he's in many different versions. It says Isaac is the son, and Ishmael is the offspring. But because he's also the son of Abraham, he will also become a great nation. And you can mark that right there, saying he will make a great nation out of this son, because we'll see that again. So Abraham rose early the next morning. He got up really early. He knew what had to be done. And he took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulders. So it was probably a good amount, because, of course, he's still the father of that child. He wants to take care of the boy, even though he knows what has to be done. And he put it on her shoulders, so she didn't have to do it. So it could possibly be heavier because it was on her shoulders like that. And he knew what he had to do, so he did it. And along with her child, she was sent away. So she was meant to go.
Yeah, I also wanted to make a quick note on how Abraham had gotten up early that morning, and it really shows his dedication and his love for his son, and even, you could say, his kind of woman, just like any father and like any father figure. You have Abraham getting up early, putting in hard work, prepping. I remember my dad on vacations, the exact opposite. He would always get ready late at night and we would leave. And I remember him prepping things and getting everything ready in the car for us, and we would leave, and then he'd drive all night. But there's just something about being a father, about being a man, and preparing your family for a trip. And so this is what Abraham's doing, because he knows that this is potentially the last time, at least the last time in a while, that he might see his son. And so although Sarah probably didn't get up early to get ready and prep things to see him because she has her resentments. Again, they both made that decision, and it obviously wasn't a smart one, but here is his son, and he can't help but love and show that he cares. So it seems he made some breakfast for them, packed them some water, and they were off.
And she left. She departed, and she was wandering in the wilderness of Beersheba. And we'll come back to that wandering in the wilderness in Beersheba again, because that comes up later.
Yeah, and again, I wanted to allude back to the story in chapter 16, where this isn't the first time Hagar is wandering out into the wilderness. The first time she was pregnant with her son, and God told her to go back. And if you remember, she was at this place called Ber Lahai Roy, which means the wells of the living one who sees me, basically. And so there were probably wells in that area. It did say she found a spring. So did she find a spring or a well? Or was there a spring and she drew it up from the well? So we see she's already had this wilderness experience with God where she's knocking on death's door and God points out to her a well that helps her to stay alive. And as we continue the story, you'll see the relevance back to chapter 16. And I also want to point to the fact that the name of this place, Ber Lahai Roy means to see me. And so she was saying, God sees me. And it's interesting because not only does God see her, but as the story continues, we'll see that God also hears her. And when you see the interaction of what happens between her and her son Ishmael, which you will see the correlation of his name, meaning essentially God hears. It's very interesting, especially in correlation with the name Beersheba, which does appear again, as Isaac mentioned, and it basically means the seven wells. So what is going to happen to Hagar and her son in this time around?
But now we're in verse 15, where after she was wandering in the desert, and it has to have been for a long time because the water in the skin was gone. We don't know about the food, but the water was completely gone.
I wanted to make another interjection. It's kind of interesting that Beersheba is actually really close to where they're staying. They hadn't went too far into the Negev, because if you remember, they're already traveling down in the Negev and in that Gerar Philistine area. So were Hagar and her son lost because they had used up all the water, and it doesn't seem they'd gotten very far? You think they would have been closer to the area of Egypt? And we'll see something that Isaac points out a little bit later, which I find is interesting and actually had never thought about myself before. But we're going to keep moving on with the story. Just something interesting to note, as well as the fact that the place Kadesh and Shur is also mentioned the chapter earlier, which is in chapter 20, but also was found in chapter 16 when Hagar was traveling the first time down into the Negev by herself when she was pregnant with Ishmael. So all really interesting stuff. People seem to repeat themselves, especially with things that they're familiar with. But let's continue on with the story.
And I mean, it's hot out there, and with no water, you're not going to last long. We all know how it is. Even when we are close to drank water recently, we know we can easily get dehydrated, and die. She put the child in one of the bushes, presumably for shade purposes, just to keep him cool. And then she went down to the opposite way away from him, about the distance of a bow shot. And she said, "Let me not look on the death of a child." So he is about to die. We see that they're dehydrated. They're long gone away from where they were. They're in rough states. We all know that a mother would do anything to keep her child alive, but at this point, she knows that they're knocking on death's door, and there's nothing that she can do to save him. She doesn't know what to do, but the thing she does know is she doesn't want to see her child die. She knows that he's going to die, and she's not worried about herself right now. She's worried about him dying, because and that emotional connection with him is something that she doesn't want to see. That's why she says, "Let me not look on the death of a child." So she sat away from him, and she lifted her voice and wept. So she's crying right now. She's upset. She knows she's going to die. She knows he is going to die. But now, verse 17, God heard the voice of the boy. Now that is interesting, because who was crying in just the last verse? Hagar was crying, not her son. So we don't know if her son was crying, if he was weeping, if he was upset, or if he was just about to die. But he said he was talking with God, and we know that by talking with God, we can presume that he might have had some teaching about who God is, and especially living with Abraham, he definitely had some of that teaching, understanding of who God is, and he was talking with God, and God heard the voice of the boy, not the voice of the mother. And the angel of God, a good person to note, angel of God, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." So the angel of God is comforting Hagar right now, and he's saying, "Don't be worried. Do not be afraid. God has heard the voice of the boy." He said, not your voice again, but the voice of the boy where he is. So he is right now. So right now they're in dire straits, but she's being comforted by the angel of the Lord, saying, "Hey, God is with you. God is with your son. God knows where he is." And now, verse 18, "Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." So God is saying, "Hey, take your son and bring him to you. Hold him still. Hold him close to you and strongly, because he's going to become a great nation." This is the second time. This is the time that Hagar hears this. And and now she understands that God has now made a promise to her, saying, "Hey, he's going to be part of a great nation." So just how Abraham had heard it in verse in earlier verses, in verse 13 and 14, where he's talking about sending them away. Yes, verse 13 is where you'll find that. Here you also talk about what that means. What does it mean to be a great nation? We talk right now, Hagar saying, is went and she's called to hold and be strong with him. And we'll see in a few different verses that she is going to be strong with him. And it's kind of it's interesting to note here too in verse 18 that you have a woman, a single mother right now, who has a boy. She has nothing right now. She doesn't have a husband. She's in the middle of the desert. Doesn't have anybody with her. She doesn't have any resources anymore. All her food is gone. She's a stranger in a foreign land. We will see later that just how uh, Hagar here is a foreigner in a strange land. We'll see the nation of Israel also be foreigners in a strange land as well, in the nation of Egypt, where Hagar is actually from. So we'll see those parallels as well. But we can also see that God is with you when you're in a foreign place, when you're in a faraway land. God is always with you, no matter what you're doing, no matter where you're going. And we see here that He is a God of the foreigner as well as a God of the nation of Israel. We have those ideas and parallels going through this entire passage here. The idea of being part of God's chosen people and being part of God's promise as well. So we see Isaac being part of the promise, but we see God also creating another promise here in verse 18, saying to Hagar herself that her son's going to be the father of a great nation. So a lot of parallels, and you'll see that throughout the entire Bible. Now, then God opened up her eyes, and she saw a well with water.
I always find this a really beautiful story, both of the accounts, and here you can see God is watching after her and her son. You can also see the parallel with the wells and God pointing out a source of water and saving her life. This is like another Ber Lahai Roy story, except this time instead of God seeing, he hears. And ironically, he even makes her see again this time.
So she saw, now that her eyes were open, which is amazing that you see her eyes open. Now, God is the one who allowed her to see this. So we'll see that God is the one who allows us to see things, and not just physically, spiritually as well, and allows us to see and drink. There's so much we can do with that, but let's continue on. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy to drink. So now they have what they need. They have water, and they have a new resolve, trusting in God to keep going. And now, as God was with the boy, so God is with him, even though God is the one who said to cast him out into the wilderness, God was with him, and God knew that this was going to happen. So He had a plan from the beginning. He knew that it wasn't meant for him to stay with Abraham. It was meant for him to grow up in the wilderness and in the desert. And as he grew up, it says, he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. This is the second time we see the word bow, because earlier we saw that Hagar was a bow shot away from her son. So it's interesting that God chose this word right here. Well, he used bow shot and bow. That's interesting because normally you don't measure things with bow shots. I know we often get criticized here in the U.S. for measuring things with all sorts of things, but when God does it, there's a reason, and we see it coming back again. We see here also that he's not only living in the wilderness, but becoming an expert with the bow, which means he is not only adapting to his circumstances, but he is now able to thrive in his circumstances, becoming an expert in everything that he needs to do so he can live and grow. And now we see him developing too. Now he lived in the wilderness of Paran. So we'll see again the nation of Israel will actually also wander in the nation of Paran. So that's another thing that God had put in there so we can see. Not just anything. Remember, God doesn't just put things in the Bible for no reason. There's so much in here. We could actually spend hours and hours talking about this, about all the things in just this passage. But we got to get going. So and let's go with verse 21. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt. So where she's from, she got him a wife. I don't know how she did that, but we can see her again standing firm with him. She's the one who got him the wife. He didn't get himself a wife, which is another interesting point to note. But she got him a wife from Egypt, and as you know, he's developing now, and now he's old enough to take a wife, and so he is taking a wife from Egypt, which is also important to note because that is the nation that his mom's from. So it's going back more towards the ideas of being part of the pagans as opposed to being part of the Jewish nation.
So as of for now, that's where we're going to leave off, and then we're going to pick up with the rest of chapter 21 next time. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.